Colorado, September 1954. The county assessor stood at the base of what looked like a crumbling stone tower in the middle of nowhere, checked his clipboard twice, and told the young woman she'd inherited a liability, not property. He wasn't alone. By October, half the town was talking about the foolish girl who'd accepted a derelict grain silo instead of selling it for demolition value. They called it everything from a death trap to a money pit. Some laughed, others expressed genuine pity. But when December's blizzard buried the region under 3 feet of snow and temperatures dropped to 28 below zero, something extraordinary happened inside those ancient stone walls. Warmth without effort, comfort without cost, and temperatures 25 degrees higher than modern homes burning coal around the clock. Today, you'll understand why the worst inheritance became the most envied dwelling in 2 counties, and how a structure everyone dismissed as worthless outperformed every conventional house when winter proved what actually mattered. Elena Vasquez stood at the base of the stone cylinder on a September afternoon in 1954, reading the deed her grandmother had left her. 22 acres of high prairie grassland and 1 grain silo, constructed sometime in the 1880s by Swedish homesteaders who'd abandoned it decades ago. She was 25 years old, newly graduated from a technical college in Denver with a degree in mechanical systems, and she owned nothing else in the world except a used pickup truck and her grandmother's conviction that this pile of stones meant something. Her grandmother had died in July, leaving behind a handwritten letter with the deed. The letter explained that the land had belonged to Elena's great-grandfather, a Swedish immigrant who'd built the silo as grain storage for a farm that never quite succeeded. The homestead had failed in 1891 during a drought. The family had moved to Denver, but her grandmother had kept the land, paying minimal taxes for 60 years, refusing to sell despite having no use for it. The letter's final paragraph was simple. This place has good bones. It wants to be something. You'll understand what I could not. The silo stood 30 feet tall and 18 feet in diameter, built from fieldstone hauled from the nearby creek bed and mortared with lime and clay. The conical roof had collapsed inward years ago. The wooden door had rotted away. Prairie grass grew through cracks in the stone floor. Swallows nested in the upper reaches. Most people saw ruins. Elena saw thermal mass. Stone holds heat. She'd learned this principle in her thermodynamics courses, studied it in textbooks, calculated it in laboratory problems. But standing here, touching walls 2 feet thick that had absorbed 70 years of summer sun and winter cold, she understood it physically. This wasn't just stone. This was a battery, capable of storing and releasing thermal energy on a scale no modern construction could match. The problem was obvious. The structure was open to the elements, unusable as shelter, and too remote to connect to electrical lines or municipal services. Everyone who saw it told her the same thing. Tear it down, sell the stone, use the money for something practical. Elena decided to do the opposite. She spent September studying the structure, measuring, calculating, planning. The stone walls were sound despite their age, held together by mortar that had hardened to near-concrete strength over decades. The foundation went deep, below the frost line, anchored in bedrock. The circular shape was structurally perfect. No corners to concentrate stress, no weak points where the geometry failed. The tower had survived 70 winters, because its form was fundamentally sound. What it needed was a roof, a floor, insulation on the interior, and a heat source that could charge the thermal mass efficiently. By October, she'd drawn plans. By early November, she'd started work. The labor was solitary and methodical. She worked weekends and evenings, driving from her temporary room in Stratton to the silo with tools and materials bought on credit from the lumber yard. Installing the interior framework meant drilling into century-old stone to anchor the furring strips. The stone was harder than modern concrete, and her drill bits wore down quickly. She learned to work in sections, measuring twice, drilling carefully, securing each furring strip with lead anchors and lag bolts. The insulation panels were rigid fiberglass, 2 inches thick, fitted between the furring strips with precise gaps to maintain the airspace behind them. Each panel had to be cut to fit the gentle curve of the circular wall, a tedious process of measuring, cutting, testing, and adjusting. The tongue and groove pine boards were salvaged from a demolished barn in Seibert, weathered wood that still had decades of life in it. She milled each board smooth, cutting away the damaged outer layer to reveal clean wood underneath, then fitted them over the insulation with finishing nails. The work took 6 weeks of part-time effort, working in cold that made her fingers numb, standing on ladders inside the stone cylinder, breathing sawdust and stone dust, coming home each night exhausted and covered in dirt. The county building inspector, Robert Chen, visited on a cold November morning when Elena was halfway through constructing an interior framework. He'd heard about the project from the lumberyard owner and came to see what was happening. He stood inside the circular space, looking up at the stone walls, the new wooden framing she was installing, and shook his head slowly. "You're wasting your time and money," Chen said. "Stone conducts cold. You'll freeze in here come winter." Elena was installing furring strips against the interior wall, creating an air gap between stone and insulation. She didn't stop working. "Stone conducts cold slowly," she said. "That's the point." Chen watched her work for a few more minutes. "That air gap won't help. Cold will soak through those walls and you won't be able to heat this space. It's too much thermal mass to warm up. You need a conventional house with proper insulation and a proper heating system." What he meant was clear. This was a foolish project by someone who didn't understand practical construction. Elena knew the numbers. She'd calculated the thermal mass of the stone walls at roughly 85 tons, at a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.2 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. The walls could store and release millions of BTUs. The trick wasn't fighting the thermal mass. The trick was using it. She finished installing the furring strips, then began hanging rigid insulation panels, creating an insulated interior shell separated from the stone by a 2-inch air gap. The air gap was critical. It prevented the insulation from directly contacting the cold stone while allowing air to circulate and moderate temperature transfer. Over the insulation, she installed tongue and groove pine boards, creating a warm wooden interior that felt nothing like the cold stone exterior. The floor required different thinking. She couldn't pour a concrete slab because she had no way to get a cement truck to this location. Instead, she built a raised wooden floor on joists, leaving a crawl space beneath. She insulated the floor heavily and installed a vapor barrier. The effect was a thermally isolated living space suspended inside the stone cylinder, separated from the thermal mass by air gaps and insulation. For the roof, she constructed a shallow dome from wooden ribs covered in tar paper and cedar shakes, leaving a small cupola at the center for ventilation and light. The dome sat inside the stone walls, protected from wind, designed to shed snow while keeping the interior space surprisingly spacious. The geometry of the circle gave her 254 square feet of floor space, enough for a live-in area, sleep-in loft, small kitchen, and storage. But the real innovation was her heating system. Elena installed a small cast-iron wood stove, not in the center where conventional wisdom would place it, but offset toward the north wall. The stove was a salvaged unit from the 1920s, solid cast iron with a flat top suitable for cooking, small enough to fit through the door, but heavy enough to anchor securely to the floor. From the stove, she ran the flue pipe horizontally for 12 feet through a channel she'd created in the insulation, then up through the roof. This violated every conventional rule about flue installation. Flues were supposed to go straight up to create maximum draft. But Elena had calculated that the heat being lost up conventional chimneys was often greater than the heat radiated into the room. The horizontal section acted as a radiator, extracting heat from the exhaust before it escaped. The pipe ran hot, radiating warmth along its entire length. More importantly, she designed the channel so exhaust heat would warm the air gap between insulation and stone. The effect was subtle, but powerful. The stove heated the interior space directly through radiation and convection. Simultaneously, exhaust heat warmed the air gap, which gradually warmed the stone walls. The stone absorbed this heat slowly over days and weeks, storing it in its massive thermal mass. Once charged, the stone released heat back toward the interior for hours after the fire died, stabilizing temperature swings and reducing fuel consumption. She'd also insulated the horizontal section of flue pipe on its outer surface, so the heat radiated inward toward the living space rather than being lost to the exterior wall. The final vertical section that exited through the roof was uninsulated, allowing enough heat loss to maintain draft while the fire burned. It was elegant. It was efficient. It made perfect thermodynamic sense. To everyone else, it looked like a young woman playing house in a grain silo. Margaret Peterson, who owned the nearest ranch 3 miles away, visited in mid-November with her daughter. She brought a casserole in genuine concern. They stood inside the nearly completed interior, and Margaret spoke carefully. "Honey, this is ambitious work, but winter here is brutal. If you need a place to stay when the cold gets serious, we have a guest room." Elena thanked her for the kindness. Margaret looked around at the circular wooden walls, the small stove, the sleeping loft accessed by a ladder. "This isn't safe," she said gently. "Stone doesn't hold heat. It pulls it away. I've lived here 40 years. I know what works and this won't." Her daughter, Sarah, was more direct. "You'll freeze," she said. "By Christmas, you'll be begging for a real house with real heat." Elena didn't argue. She understood their concern came from experience. But their experience was with conventional construction, structures that fought thermal mass instead of using it. She'd built something different. The first real test came on November 28th, when an early winter storm dropped temperatures to 15 degrees and dumped 8 inches of snow. Elena lit her wood stove at 5 p.m., burned a modest fire for 3 hours, and let it die to coals by 9 p.m. The interior temperature held at 64 degrees all night. She woke at 6 a.m. to an interior temperature of 59 degrees. Outside, it was 8 degrees. She built another fire, and the cycle repeated. She used 6 pieces of split pine in 24 hours. Margaret Peterson, 3 miles away in her conventional ranch house, burned an armload of logs every 4 hours just to keep the main rooms comfortable. Her family woke twice each night to feed the fire. Her children slept in extra layers. December brought typical high prairie weather, cold nights, moderate days, occasional snow that melted quickly. Elena settled into her teaching position at the elementary school in Stratton, 15 miles away. She drove to town each morning, returned each evening, and gradually became known as the woman living in the old silo. Curiosity brought visitors. James Holland, who ran the feed store, stopped by in early December supposedly to discuss property lines. He stepped inside and looked around with obvious surprise. "It's actually warm in here," he said. Elena was grading papers at a small desk near the window. The stove had been cold for 6 hours. The interior was 61 degrees. "How?" Holland asked, touching the wooden walls. "There's no fire." "The stone stores heat," Elena explained. "The walls are warm from yesterday's fire and they're releasing it slowly." Holland pressed his palm against the wall, feeling the faint warmth coming through the wood. He walked around the circular interior, examining the construction, trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he knew about stone structures. "This shouldn't work," he said finally. "But it does," Elena said simply. Word spread slowly. A few skeptics became curious. Ellen Morrison, a nurse who'd worked with Elena's grandmother, visited in mid-December with her husband. They arrived in late afternoon and stayed for coffee. The stove was burning, filling the space with radiant warmth. But what impressed them was the lack of cold spots. In their farmhouse, the areas near the fire were hot, the corners were cold, and drafts made you choose between burning up or freezing. Here, the temperature felt uniform, stable, comfortable. "How much wood do you use?" Morrison's husband asked. "Maybe half a cord so far this winter," Elena said. Morrison did the math in his head. His family had already burned through 2 cords, and winter had barely started. He looked at his wife, then back at Elena. "You're doing something right," he said quietly. Not everyone was convinced. Robert Chen, the building inspector, returned in late December to check if Elena had actually moved into the structure despite his warnings. He found her cooking dinner on a small propane camp stove, the interior warm and lived in. "You're still here," he said. "Still here," Elena confirmed. Chen looked uncomfortable. "Look, I respect your determination, but when the real cold comes, this place will be dangerous. Stone doesn't insulate. You've got maybe 2 inches of insulation between you and freezing stone. That's not enough." "The stone isn't freezing," Elena said. "It's 45 degrees. Chen blinked. "What?" "The stone walls," Elena explained. "They're not at exterior temperature. They're somewhere between interior and exterior. Probably around 45 degrees right now. The air gap and insulation slow heat transfer in both directions. The stone is acting as a thermal buffer." Chen didn't understand the thermodynamics, but he understood numbers. If the stone was 45 degrees instead of the outside temperature of 20 degrees, something was working. He left without saying much more, but his expression had shifted from concern to confusion. The real test arrived on January 6, 1955. A massive Arctic system swept down from Canada, dropping temperatures across eastern Colorado to record lows. Stratton hit 28 below zero. Wind chills reached 45 below. Schools closed. Livestock died in their shelters. Families burned coal and wood continuously, and still their houses struggled to stay above 50 degrees. The cold lasted 5 days. Elena's routine didn't change. Fire in the evening, burn for 3 hours, let it die to coals. The interior temperature held between 58 and 64 degrees throughout the cold snap. The stone walls, charged with weeks of accumulated heat, released their stored energy slowly, buffering the brutal exterior temperatures. She used slightly more wood than normal, maybe 8 pieces per day instead of 6, but nothing approaching the desperate consumption happening in conventional houses. On January 9th, Margaret Peterson showed up at Elena's door at 3 p.m. Her truck was loaded with her daughter Sarah, 3 grandchildren aged 4, 6, and 8, and emergency supplies hastily thrown into boxes. Their ranch house had become uninhabitable, despite burning everything they could find: coal, wood, even furniture from unused rooms. Despite closing off the bedrooms and kitchen and huddling around the massive stone fireplace that had cost them 2 years' worth of savings to build, they couldn't keep the temperature above 42 degrees. The children had stopped complaining about the cold. That was what frightened Margaret most. They'd gone quiet, listless, their lips faintly blue despite layers of clothing and blankets. The youngest had started coughing. Sarah's husband had left that morning to drive to Burlington for more coal, a dangerous trip in the extreme cold, and wouldn't return until the next day. Margaret had driven 3 miles through dangerous cold because Elena's silo was the closest structure, and she'd heard impossible rumors from James Holland that it was somehow warm. She dismissed the rumors as exaggeration, but desperation made her try anyway. Elena opened the door. The interior was 62 degrees. The stove had been cold since morning. Margaret stood in the doorway, feeling the warm air, and started crying. "How?" was all she could say. "Come inside," Elena said. The Peterson family stayed for 2 days, sleeping in the main room while Elena took the loft. Elena built fires twice daily, modest burns that lasted 3 hours each, maintaining comfortable temperatures easily. The transformation in the children was visible within hours. Color returned to their faces. They stopped shivering. The youngest's cough eased. By evening of the first day, they were playing quietly, something they hadn't had energy for in days. They slept that night without waking, without huddling together for warmth, sprawled out in genuine comfort for the first time in a week. Margaret watched this transformation with something between relief and confusion, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd believed about stone and cold. On the second evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Margaret sat on the floor near the stove, watching her grandchildren sleep peacefully, and spoke quietly. "I told you this wouldn't work. I was certain you'd freeze." Elena sat beside her. "You weren't wrong to be skeptical. This shouldn't work according to conventional understanding. Stone is supposed to conduct cold, not store heat. But thermal mass works both ways. If you charge it slowly with modest heat over time, it becomes a battery. Conventional houses fight the cold every night from zero. this structure starts each night with 85 tons of stone already at 50 degrees, releasing that stored warmth inward. Margaret touched the wooden wall, feeling the faint warmth radiating through. My house has a massive stone fireplace. Cost a fortune to build. But it's cold everywhere except right next to the fire. Elena nodded. Fireplaces radiate heat in one direction and send most of their energy up the chimney. They're beautiful and traditional, but they're thermally inefficient. This stove is small, but it's efficient. And more importantly, the heat it produces charges the thermal mass instead of escaping. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When this cold breaks, she said, I want you to explain this to my husband. We're not tearing down our house, but we need to understand what you've done here. The cold snap ended on January 11th. Temperatures climbed to a balmy 18 degrees. The Peterson family returned home, and Margaret spread the word. That girl in the silo stayed warm when the rest of us nearly froze. Within a week, Elena had visitors nearly every evening. James Holland brought his wife. Robert Chen came back with genuine questions instead of warnings. Ranchers who dismissed the silo as a foolish project came to see it for themselves. Each visitor experienced the same surprise, stepping into warmth that felt effortless, stable, and completely unlike the forced heat of stoves and fireplaces fighting losing battles against winter. David Kern, a builder from Burlington, visited in late January with a notebook and measuring tape. He'd built houses for 30 years and needed to understand what was happening. Elena walked him through the design, the thermal mass of the stone, the insulated interior shell, the air gap, the horizontal flue pipe that extracted exhaust heat, the circular geometry that eliminated corners and cold spots. Kern took notes, asked technical questions, and finally sat down on the floor, thinking. I've been building wrong, he said quietly. Not wrong exactly, but inefficiently. We build to resist cold with insulation and heating. You built to store warmth with mass and geometry. Elena shook her head. You build what people want and expect. I built what thermodynamics required. There's no right or wrong, just different approaches. Kern disagreed. There's efficiency and waste. This is efficient. Most houses are waste. By February, Elena's silo had become a curiosity that drew visitors from neighboring counties. Not all of them came with open minds. Thomas Bradford, a prominent builder from Lyman who'd constructed half the commercial buildings in 3 counties, came specifically to debunk what he considered impossible claims. He'd heard the stories from clients, from suppliers, from other builders, and he considered them dangerous nonsense that might convince people to make foolish building decisions. He arrived on a cold February morning with a calibrated thermometer, a notebook, and 30 years of building experience that told him stone structures couldn't stay warm. He measured interior and exterior temperatures, 63 degrees inside, 12 degrees outside. He examined the construction, checking the insulation installation, measuring the air gap, inspecting the flue pipe routing. He spent an hour opening cabinets, looking in corners, checking for hidden heating elements, propane heaters, electrical resistance heaters, anything that could explain what shouldn't be possible. There has to be another heat source, he insisted, frustrated by his inability to find the trick. A small space like this can't hold heat this well with just a wood stove burning 3 hours a day. The numbers don't work. Elena showed him her wood supply. She'd used less than 3/4 of a cord all winter. Bradford's own home had consumed 6 cords in the same period. He measured the stone walls, checked for hidden heating systems, and finally ran out of places to look. The thermal mass, Elena explained again. 85 tons of stone at 45 degrees releases heat constantly. I'm not fighting winter from scratch every night. I'm starting with a pre-warmed structure. Bradford left without conceding anything, but he stopped calling it impossible. The coldest reading that winter came on February 14th, when temperatures dropped to 31 below. Elena's interior temperature never fell below 57 degrees, maintained with 2 modest fires. Margaret Peterson's ranch house, with twice the wood consumption and newer construction, struggled to maintain 48 degrees. Spring came slowly to eastern Colorado in 1955. But when it arrived, something had fundamentally changed. Margaret Peterson showed up in March with a proposition. We're building a bunkhouse for seasonal workers. Edward wants to build traditional, but I'm asking if you'd consult on making it more efficient. We can't replicate your silo, but maybe we can use some of your principles. It was more than a job offer. It was validation. Elena worked with the Petersons to design a structure that incorporated thermal mass through a stone wall on the north side, better insulation, and a more efficient heating system. It wasn't a silo, but it used the same physics. By April, 3 more families had contacted Elena. By May, she had requests to consult on 7 building projects. The spread wasn't dramatic. It wasn't revolutionary. It was quiet, practical adoption by people who'd learned through frozen nights that efficiency matters more than tradition when survival depends on it. James Holland built an addition to his house, incorporating a thermal mass wall and improved insulation. It cut his winter wood consumption by 35%. David Kern, the builder from Burlington, started recommending thermal mass design elements to clients. He couldn't convince most people to abandon conventional construction, but he could show them how to make it more efficient. Robert Chen, the building inspector who'd called the silo dangerous, revised his understanding of building codes. He started asking builders about thermal performance, not just structural safety. By the winter of 1955 to 1956, 11 structures in the region incorporated elements of Elena's approach. Not all were circular stone towers. Most were conventional houses with thermal mass modifications, better insulation strategies, more efficient heating systems. But they all shared the same principle: work with physics, not against it. The cultural resistance didn't disappear overnight. There were still builders who insisted that traditional methods were the only proper way to construct homes. There were still people who valued appearance and convention over efficiency. But after the winter of 1955, no one called Elena's silo a death trap anymore. The numbers had silenced the mockery. What's remarkable isn't that Elena created an efficient dwelling. Humans have been solving thermal problems for thousands of years. What's remarkable is how completely conventional wisdom had calcified into assumed truth, and how resistant people were to questioning it even when the evidence was obvious. Robert Chen had decades of building inspection experience. He knew what passed code, what looked proper, what followed standard practice. But standard and optimal aren't the same thing. Elena didn't disrespect conventional knowledge. She understood its principles and asked a simple question: can physics do this better? The stone walls provided thermal mass that stabilized temperature swings. The circular shape eliminated corners where heat escaped. The insulated interior shell trapped warmth while allowing the stone to moderate temperature slowly. The efficient wood stove charged the system without waste. The horizontal flue recovered exhaust heat that would normally vanish up a chimney. None of these concepts were new. Thermal mass had been used in European building for centuries. Efficient combustion was understood by anyone who'd heated with scarce fuel. Elena just combined them with engineering precision and the unique opportunity of an abandoned stone structure. The result was a dwelling that outperformed conventional houses by every measurable metric while using a fraction of the resources. That's not luck. That's not novelty. That's what happens when you respect physics without being enslaved to convention. The silo stood for another 43 years. Elena lived in it until 1972 when she married David Kern, and they built a larger home nearby. But she kept the original structure maintained, using it as a studio and retreat. Visitors always commented on the same thing. Stepping inside felt like entering a different climate zone. Even without heat, the thermal mass kept temperatures remarkably stable. In 1989, a Colorado State University architecture student wrote her thesis on vernacular thermal design in rural Colorado. She documented Elena's silo and 17 other structures influenced by its principles, all built between 1955 and 1970. The conclusion was straightforward. Vasquez's approach reduced winter heating requirements by an average of 64% compared to contemporary conventional construction while improving thermal comfort and reducing labor. The design's adoption correlates directly with exposure to empirical data during the 1955 cold snap. In other words, people believed the numbers when they couldn't deny them anymore. Elena Vasquez Kern passed away in 1998 at the age of 69. Her obituary in the Stratton News mentioned her teaching career, her family, and her work as a building consultant. But locals remembered something else. They remembered the winter when a young woman proved that a worthless inheritance could be 25 degrees warmer than modern houses burning coal around the clock, because she understood that the best solutions often come from questioning everything everyone assumes is settled truth. She wasn't being stubborn. She was being practical. And sometimes practical looks foolish until winter proves it undeniable.